Hello, and good morning, and welcome back to another session of Vetter's Corner. Today I'm going to cover something I'm sure historically a lot of people aren't aware of. And a lot of people talk about the 613 commandments. And I'm going to come right out and just say, historically, 613 commandments aren't biblical. I'm sorry. And I'm going to prove it to you. Because there's so much out there right now that you can literally, historically, check on these things. Even in the early church fathers, they have a written dedicate for the foundation of their beliefs. I'll use that as an example. But in Judaism, they have what they call the Mishnah. They have the Talmud. They have the Gemara. They have all these little different subcategories of interpretation and whatnot of the book of the law. That would be the book of the covenant. And the 10 commandments stand on their own. Okay? And when I get into this a little bit, I'm going to be using my notes that I had from a while back. And I'm refresh them, so to speak, so I could cover this. But in order to understand the 613 commandments that are basically heaped upon us, both Jew and Gentile, although we are all one in the Messiah, it's important to put this stuff into context. And it's historical context. Because a lot of times it's important to check out the early church fathers and the rabbinical studies, the avots, or I don't know how to pronounce it. It's like AVOT, avots, and look at them in particular and use it for personal study, which I find very informative, from the Mishnah and the Talmud and so on and so forth. But first, let's talk about something that's important. And I'm going to be glancing down at my notes quite a bit, okay? But the oral law, at the time of Mount Sinai, where the book of the covenant was covered in the blood of the covenant, and where the 10 words were spoken from the fire, and the I am added no more, the oral law, or the oral Torah, they never wrote down except for what Moses wrote down. So there was some traditions that were passed down orally and were not written down by Moses, because we see the 5 books, well, as a matter of fact, the whole canonization of Scripture, we see its finished work, so to speak, okay? And we can't, a lot of people misinterpret Scripture because they don't understand the history behind it. But in the Jewish tradition, these things were in the Jewish tradition. Okay, now understand my words here. In the Jewish tradition, okay, it is believed that the oral Torah, or the oral law, was revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai alongside with the written Torah. Perhaps some, but not all. And we're really reaching for a conclusion that's probably not there. So we do see today the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as the 5 books completed by Moses in the writing of Moses. And this served as a testimony with Israel's travels in the wilderness and into the promised land, their Exodus, and so on and so forth. So the oral law was transmuted or transmitted throughout many centuries of starting at Mount Sinai and going all the way up to the time of Jesus. I'm serious. So, we're looking at what? I don't know how long, maybe 1,000 years, maybe. I don't know the exact timeline, so I'm not going to speculate on that. But so all this was going on for many centuries, preserving the interpretations, legal rulings, ethical teachings, and traditions that explained and applied to the written Torah. This is part of the oral law. And then we see in 200 CE of the Common Era, okay, this is after Christ and Paul, and also the Rabbi Judah, the prince. The Mishnah was the first written record of the oral law, organizing the traditions into 6 main sections. And then 300 years later, in the 500 CE, the Mishnah was expanded and interpreted in the Talmud. Okay, and there's Jerusalem, Israel's Talmud, and the Babylonian Talmud, the two, which became the authoritative written form of the oral law. And a lot of people get confused with Paul because he speaks to the oral law, and towards the end I'll get to that and I'll show you. And then he also speaks to the book of the law, okay, so which includes the 10 Commandments. Okay, so the Gemara is basically a collection. The Talmud, also known as the Gemara, is a collection of rabbinical analysis and commentaries on the Mishnah. And what I just say about the Mishnah is the organization and the written record of the oral law, the first written record of the oral law, organizing the traditions into 6 main sections. Now, hold on a minute. If all of Scripture is breathed by God and is used for sound doctrine, and now we're interjecting the Mishnah and the Talmud into it, are we then not using the analysis and the commentaries of the rabbis to then produce in us what we would call halakha, righteousness? And like I said, I'll get to it. I'll show you what Paul was talking about in his own words, okay? So all of these things that I'm talking about, the Mishnah, the Talmud, also known as the Gemara, are all coming from the oral law, explaining how to apply the written Torah. These concepts also were born, I'm trying to look for the correct word here, born these things called hedges, okay? And these hedges, according to the Mishnah, Avot 1:1, are building a fence around Torah, okay? And it's very important to understand that, but building a fence around Torah, so these are called hedges. And a lot of these hedges, the Messiah referenced to the Sadducees and the Pharisees of tying heavy burdens around the people's necks. And you can find the complete rebuke from the Messiah to these, woe you blind guides, woe this and woe that. You'll find that in Matthew 23, and I encourage you to read the context of the entire chapter of Matthew 23. So this imagery that the Messiah gave off to the Sadducees and the Pharisees gave us a cultural context of first century Judaism. And it put it in perspective for us then to say, wait, what's going on here? Because it's obvious that when the Messiah said, you strain at a gnat, but you swallow a camel whole. Now, this is very important. This is something that you have to grasp to understand this. A gnat, according to Leviticus 11, 20 to 23, is the smallest unclean creature mentioned. According to Leviticus 11, 20 to 23. And they would painstakingly filter out the water and the wine to maintain ritual purity. These Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Levitical priesthood, would spend much time filtering out these gnats out of the wine and the water. And I'm like, filtering these little unclean creatures out of the water, and I'm thinking living water, and out of the wine, I'm thinking true wine, and almost like saying a little leaven spoils the whole lump, right? And I'm like, wow, that's kind of interesting to think about. But then you find out that the camel in Leviticus 11:14 was among the largest unclean animals. So literally, the Messiah was making a point, and that point was, you're accusing these people of minor infractions against your oral traditions, while ignoring the major moral and spiritual responsibilities of justice, mercy, and faithfulness within the book of the law. So right here, we can identify the differences between the Talmud, which wasn't written yet, but the oral law, which was definitely in motion, and the book of the law written at Mount Sinai. So the oral traditions and the oral law still existed, and I would assume, based on not actually having an exact count, that this happened after Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land, and Joshua led them in there. Because I believe in Joshua 1 verse 8, it says he is to meditate on the law daily. And there was a blessing to that. So yeah, that's important. I could look up the scripture right now, but I don't. Let me see here. Let me see if I can't find it real quick. Josh. Let me see if I remember correctly. Yes, it is Joshua 1:8. It says, "This book of the law must not depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night." And it came with a promise. "So that you may be careful to do everything written in it." So that it's not talking about the oral law. "For then you will prosper and succeed in all you do." That's why I say I'm not poo-pooing or say don't do what the book of the law says. Study it. Okay? That's the meat of the word. Okay? So, but the Messiah summed up the 10 commandments by love thy neighbor and love the Lord thy God. Right? So let's stay focused on what we're discussing here. So, all these minor infractions are basically Sadducees and Pharisees hanging these heavy burdens on the people and not lifting a finger to help them, and forgetting that justice, mercy, and faithfulness is within the book of the law. And Lord knows, Joshua 1:8, it comes with a promise. Okay? So just like the oral traditions later codified and written down focused on works outside the righteousness within the actual book of the law, and Jesus was even saying to them that the least of their oral laws were unclean. The gnat was unclean just as much as the major ones were unclean. So you filter out the gnat, but swallow a camel whole, it says. Wow. So when you focus in on perspective and historical evidence, these things begin to come to light. And a lot of people are like, well, how can you trust the historical evidence of these things? Well, this is where witnesses comes in, and Scripture backs it up. And I just shared with you how Scripture backs this up. So now the next step, we also see in Romans 10:4 another verification of the righteousness within the law. Okay? However, in Romans 10:4, it says, "For Christ was the end, telos, of righteousness within the law. Because his righteousness brought the law to its goal or purpose. So when we abide in him, there is no condemnation. We abide in his righteousness. And then we're learning, grace allows us to learn the ways of his righteousness, so then that it applies to our life, and then we become that spotless bride. It's a process. So don't expect it to happen overnight, okay? Because if you do, you're probably going to be stepping into that line of self-righteousness, and now you're going to get in trouble, okay? So stick to what we know, all right? So Paul also said in 2 Timothy 3:15 that these holy scriptures make us wise unto salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. So these holy scriptures that Paul was talking about was the Tanakh, the Old Testament, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets. And even the Messiah said, I didn't come to destroy the Torah, the writings, and the prophets. So again, perspective, context, historical evidence is backing this up. So what's the next case for an historical connotation towards understanding traditions that are not of God, but are heaped on us by man? You could find it no further than the canon of Scripture. It also identifies a certain aspect of what I'm talking about. So, historically speaking, we see that the Mishnah and the Talmud was in the range of 200 CE and 500 CE when all these things became, of the oral law that became written down. Now notice something. There was no canonization of Scripture yet. So all the books and chapters and all this stuff wasn't organized yet. But the Bible we know it today did not come into existence all at once. Okay? It was canonized over a long period of time. Its canonization was formed over centuries through the process which involved deciding which writings were authoritative from a religious community. Now, this is where the church, apostolic church, stepped in, and by their authority started to work on these different things within the canonization of Scripture. So the Old Testament canon, that would be the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, was largely settled by the time of Jesus, around 30 AD. Okay? Now, according to history, the Masoretic text come into play around the 7th century, somewhere in there BCE. And this is the authoritative Hebrew version compiled and codified by Jewish scribes. So the Masoretic text, some people will really, how shall we say this, disapprove of the Masoretic text. Okay? Then we see the Greek Septuagint, or the Codex. Platonicus, I believe is how it's pronounced, developed in the 3rd century BCE. That's before Christ, before the Common Era. So these things were being established before Christ. So when our Messiah spoke to these things, he already knew what was going on, right? So the New Testament canon. Now this is something interesting, because the 27 books of the New Testament weren't written until the end of the 1st century. Okay? Early Christians used many of these writings, but there was no single agreed upon list until later. Okay? So the New Testament writings weren't quite agreed upon. And this would be the year 100 AD, the 1st century. So this is after Paul, after the Messiah, Peter, all of them. Okay? And we see that the Council of Laodicea convened around 363 AD and produced one of the earliest known formal lists of the New Testament books. Okay, so I'm kind of paraphrasing everything using my notes here. And the Council of Carthage in 397 AD, and later the Council of Trent in 1546 AD. Okay? The Council of Trent helped solidify the 27 book list in the Catholic and Protestant traditions. So we have a historical backing of what's going on. And then we see that the key time, just to paraphrase the timeline here, the 3rd century BCE, we have the Greek Septuagint completed, Codex Vaticanus. The 8th century BCE, we have the Hebrew canon compiled, using the Masoretic text. Then in the 3rd, 4th centuries AD, after the New Testament books were written in 1st century AD, we have the early councils beginning formalizing the lists, putting it into chapters and whatnot. Then in the 4th century AD, widespread agreement came about on the 27-book New Testament canon. Later, in the Council of Trent, they finalized and actually defended the canon in the Christian tradition. Okay? So you have a Judaism tradition, and now you have a Christian tradition. That's why I mentioned the Didache. Okay? In short, the Old Testament canon was largely settled by Jesus' time. That's the Old Testament, the Holy Scriptures Paul talked about, with its Hebrew form codified centuries earlier, while the New Testament canon was written in the 1st century AD and formally recognized in the 4th century AD. So we can see a 300 to 400 year span here in which all this stuff was coming to fruition. Okay? So now let's move into something, the documentation of the 613 commandments or mitzvot, instructions. And this came about from a rabbi named Maimonides, also nicknamed Rambam, but there was a rabbi before that mentioned this. And so we're going to get into that so you can see what I'm talking about. The 613 commandments are systemized rabbinic tradition developed over centuries, rooted in the Torah, and later codified by medieval Jewish scholars. According to the Jewish tradition, the number 613 first appears in the Talmud, Makot 23b, where Rabbi Simlai states Moses received the 613 commandments at Mount Sinai. We know that's not true. Those 613 commandments were the oral traditions passed around. So there's no evidence of this type of tradition where the Rabbi Simlai states Moses received 613 commandments at Mount Sinai. And there's no evidence of that. We see the book of the law, and we see the 10 commandments, and we see the blood covenant, and we see many different things going on in the wilderness, the establishment of the priesthood, and then many different things going on in the wilderness, different rulings and stuff like that going on in the wilderness that Moses wrote about. But it's hard for me to recollect and say, yeah, sure, 613 commandments, oral traditions or whatever were given to Moses. I'm sorry. It's just not part of Scripture. Okay? So the Talmud does not list the commandments, but it sets the framework of their enumeration. Okay? Making them into a list. Maimonides Rambam in his Mishnah Torah later systemized the list into 248 positive commandments to do, and 365 negative commandments to avoid, symbolizing the days of the year and the parts of the human body. Now, there's no evidence that we have enough 365 days a year that I believe I looked it up. I think it was like 209 bodies in the adult and more in the infants. So it doesn't equate. It doesn't work out, okay? So the idea of the 613 commandments was mentioned in the Talmud, Makot 23b, in the 3rd century CE by Rabbi Simlai, which I talked about, Simlai. Some rabbis say the source of the Torah is the gematria score of 611. And the two main commandments of love the Lord thy God and love thy neighbor as thyself, or they're saying the first two commands of love for God adds to the 611 and makes up the 613 commands. So again, it's like they're fishing to make it match up and to make it work. And we're told not to do that. Let Scripture speak for itself. Okay? So, the Mishnah Torah was systematized by Maimonides in the 12th century. So here we are going all the way back to, let's just say, the 7th century BCE, and then we're seeing all of a sudden somebody taking liberties with a sermon to create 613 commands. Folks, I could easily argue that the 613 commands, some of them are man-made and they're traditions of men and not of God. That's why the Bible tells us that we obey the doctrines of men or the commandments of men rather than the commandments of God. I'm identifying that for you right here and now. So I mentioned Paul, and in closing, I mentioned Paul. And if you turn to Philippians 3, 1 through 8 and read in context what he's saying, he's literally telling you that his work of rabbinical Judaism and the law, he separates it. He tells you. In regard to the law, the Torah, a Pharisee. And he gave all this up for Yeshua HaMashiach. Okay? And yet Paul still said that as for the law based on righteousness, which is the halakha, he's talking about the Talmud, or you can talk the Mishnah, the Gematria, okay? The law based on righteousness, he was faultless in. Faultless in. And he even considered all the prestige and the rabbinical authority he had as garbage, as dung, just to gain the Messiah. So he's telling you that according to the Torah, I'm a Pharisee and I kept it. According to the halakha, I was the law that's based on righteousness, according to the halakha, he was faultless in. He's showing you right there the book of the law, which includes the Ten Commandments, versus the oral law, the traditions at that time that later became the Talmud. He knew the oral law. Don't think he didn't. He knew it. So put this stuff in perspective and see, and I could literally argue and have no problem saying this. The 613 commands, some of them are not Torah-based. They're man-made and they're traditions of men, created for hedges as a fence around the Torah. And these were heavy burdens and light burdens, a gnat and a camel that were tied onto these people's backs. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees forgot all about love, justice, mercy, and all that is actually pertained in the law, especially love. So, folks, I hope it opened up your mind a little bit to take a look at this historically, and then to take a look at this biblically and see if you can find what I'm talking about. It's very important that you establish, because people are saying, nobody can keep 613 commandments. Well, duh. Because they're not God's commandments. They're man's commandments, and it's the fault of man that literally screwed everything up. So now we're being restored back to his image and likeness, and we are indeed flesh becoming the Word. So folks, I love you. let's get into this historical study. Dig into it, find out. And if you have found something that I did not cover, please hit that like, make a comment, and let's get involved and start building and edifying each other, because this is important. All right. Love you all. You have a great day. Peace out.